All right, so now we're going to learn how to multiply imaginary numbers. And when we multiply imaginary numbers, it's the same as if we were multiplying real numbers with some form of variable at the end. Because those imaginary numbers have the i's at the end, we're going to treat them kind of like x's and multiply them accordingly. And then the big thing to remember on here, and I told you this in one of the previous videos, is that I squared is equal to -1. We're going to use that one a lot on this. So, let's get started with the first example. So example number 1 says 4i times 7i. Now, when we multiply, like I said, when we multiply imaginary numbers, it's like we're multiplying real numbers, except for you've got that variable at the end, the i's. So what we're going to do is do 4 times 7, which gives us 28, and then I times I would give me I squared. Now, normally, if this was just a normal variable like x, we would be done. We would just say 28i squared. But because these are imaginary numbers, we can simplify that squared. We know that I squared is -1, which means this is the same thing as saying 28 times -1, right? Which 28 times -1 is a -28. So our final answer is just -28. As you can see, that -28 is a little bit simpler than 28i squared. That's why we like it a little bit more. Let's do that second example now. And the second example has an imaginary number and then a complex number. Because that complex number has a real part and an imaginary part, we have to distribute the first imaginary number. So we have to distribute the 5i into the 7 and the -2i. Meaning that we're going to multiply the 5i by the 7 and multiply the 5i by the -2i. So when we do 5i times 7, we would get 35i, because 5 times 7 is 35, and then the 7 doesn't have an i, but the 5 does, so there's just one i. Now we're going to do 5i times -2i. 5 times -2 gives me a -10, and then we have an I times an I, because both the 5i and the 2i have i's. So that means it's going to give me -10i squared. So, same thing as the last example. We're going to change that I squared, because we know I squared is -1. I'm going to change it to be, the I squared to be -1, which means I can write it as 35i minus 10 times -1, which can simplify down to 35i. -10 times -1 gives me a positive 10. Now that is the correct answer, but remember from the last video, we want it to be in the correct complex form, which means the real part has to go first and then the imaginary part goes second, which means my final answer is 10 plus 35i. All right, let's look at that third example now. For the third example, we have 2 minus 6i times 7 plus 2i. Now, you have two complex numbers here, and it looks really similar to something that if you had variables in here instead of imaginary numbers, you would have to FOIL. And if you remember foiling, you have to make all the different combinations. So foiling, if you remember, FOIL stands for first, outside, inside, and last. Which means the first ones, we're going to multiply the first two numbers together, which are the 2 and the 7. So 2 times 7 gives me 14. There's no imaginary parts on there. We're good there. Now we're going to do the O in the FOIL, which means that it's outside. So we're going to do the two outside numbers, which are the 2 and then the 2i. So 2 times 2i would give me 4i. Now we're going to do the I on the FOIL, which is inside. So we're going to do the two inside numbers. So -6i times 7. So -6 times 7 gives me a -42. And then I, because the 6 has an I on it. And the very last part of FOIL is the L, which means that it's last, which we're going to do the last two numbers in each set of parentheses. So -6i and 2i. -6 times 2 gives me a -12, and then I times I is an I squared. I'm going to put that, I kind of erased that, the dot of the I. So that's good. Like we've gone through all the different combinations. We've done the foiling part. Now what we're going to do is simplify this a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do is change that I squared to be -1. So I'm going to have 14 plus 4i minus 42i minus 12. Because of the I squared is negative 1, I'm going to change it to negative 1. Then we're going to simplify it even a little bit further and say 14 plus 4i minus 42i. Negative 12 times negative 1 gives me a positive 12. Now that we have no I squareds, like we simplified all of that down, what we're going to do is combine like terms. And we have the 14 and the 12. Those are considered our real parts because we got rid of the i's on them. And 14 plus 12 gives me 26. And then we'd have the imaginary parts, which are 4i and negative 42i. And we can combine those because they both only have one I, which means that it will be 42 minus 4, which is, or sorry, negative 42 plus 4, which gives me negative 38i. And this would be my final answer. It's in correct complex form, and there's no I squareds or anything like that. Okay, let's do one last example. And this example is I times negative 5 plus 9i times negative 3 plus 2i. This has three different chunks that we multiply with. It's an imaginary number, a complex number, and a complex number. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of forget about that first imaginary number, just the first I, just for a second, okay? And what we're going to do is FOIL this part of it and get it simplified down to kind of how we had number 3. Then once we have it simplified down, we will multiply or distribute that extra I in there. So let's start by the FOILing. So we're going to start first, which would be negative 5 times negative 3, which gives me a positive 15. Then outside, negative 5 times 2i gives me a negative 10i. Inside, 9i times negative 3 gives me a negative 27i. And then last, which gives me 9i times 2i, which gives me an 18i squared. Now, we know that I squared is negative 1, so we can say 15 minus 10i minus 27i plus 18 times negative 1. We're going to simplify that down to be minus 18 because 18 times negative 1 is a negative 18. Then we can combine like terms. The 15 and the negative 18 are my real parts, which would give me negative 3. And then negative 10i and negative 27i are my imaginary parts, which would give me negative 37i. Now that part is just the last two sets of parentheses. But remember that I that we decided that we were going to forget about until now is still there. So we're still going to simplify a little bit. And to simplify this, we're going to distribute that I into it by multiplying the I by both negative 3 and negative 37i. So I times negative 3 is just a negative 3i. And then I times negative 37i would give me a negative 37i squared. Now we're close to finished, but now that we have another I squared, which means that we're going to change that to negative 1. So we get negative 3i minus 37, but instead of I squared, we're going to put negative 1, which means I have negative 3i plus 37 because negative 37 times negative 1 gives me a positive 37. That's correct, but we want to put it in correct complex format, which means the real part has to go first. So my final answer is 37 minus 3i. And there we have it, how to multiply